Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Should elected officials govern by referendum, referendi, whatever the case? Well, I'm not sure myself, so why don't we have a referendum as to whether or not we should use referendums? Okay, forgive me for the cattiness here, but it's a question that comes up from time to time. And the latest example was because of the results in Newfoundland and Labrador. Just a while ago, a couple of days ago, they had a provincial election there, and a new premier was selected. His name is Tony Wakeham. He's the Conservative who will be the premier when he gets sworn in. But anyway, in his after-election comments during his victory speech, he referenced one of the key elements, I guess one of the controversial issues in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that, of course, is the Churchill Falls project. And he indicated at that time that he wanted to hold a referendum to see as to whether or not they should go forward in this. I've got some concerns about this, not specifically with Premier-elect Wakeham's idea here, or even with the project, but with the idea of using referendum to govern. And it's not as if it's not something that we've seen come time and time again here. I've talked to skeptics on one side that will say, look, it's just governments or politicians either abdicating their responsibility. Others are saying, no, it's the voice of the people. You have to hear the voice of the people, and that's how you should make decisions because they're there to represent the people. Well, let's look at those if we could for just a second. And as I say, there's no shortage of examples of this. The province of Quebec in my lifetime has had two referendums, one as to whether or not they should separate. They barely won, both of them. The second was very, very close. But therein lies part of the problem as to exactly what are the implications, what's going to happen as a result. Even the wording of the question can be problematic sometimes. I was trying to dig up the wording on this, but the first referendum that was held back in the 70s, I guess it was, with René Lévesque still the premier, the wording basically said that if you wanted to stay in Canada, that you had to answer no to the question, the way that it was phrased. And it was very complicated and very confusing for an awful lot of voters. So there's that element, who's going to be in charge of this. In Ontario, and I guess in other provinces, but I can recall a few years ago in Ontario, then Premier Dalton McGuinty wanted to hold a referendum and did hold a referendum about how we vote, the system that we use to vote. The one that we use most of the time here in elections, it's called first past the post, which essentially means the candidate that gets the most votes is the winner. And that was pretty simple when there was just two parties and two candidates running for any particular seat. If you got 50% plus one, you were the winner. Well, now you've got multiple candidates, of course. So you don't need 50% of the vote. You don't need a majority vote to get elected. You just have to get more than any other individual. And a lot of people have a problem with that. So they said this should be a referendum. And we've talked about this on the show, the radio show, for years and on the podcast. Because there are a couple of alternative ways of doing this, that some people have talked about. Well, they tried to do this in Ontario, and overwhelmingly they turned it down and said, no, let's just stick with what we got. It's got all sorts of problems, but it's the devil we know. So that didn't work, even though the government seemed to want to move in that direction. And it's happened in others. Danielle Smith in Alberta right now, it seems like she's trying to gather enough steam to hold a referendum as to whether or not Alberta should separate from Canada. Mind you, the stories we're seeing indicate that she's getting a lot of resistance to even holding a referendum. I guess she's got to get so many signatures on a petition, and there are counter petitions that are being circulated too that seem to be gaining a lot more steam than her idea does too. So I don't know where that's going, but the reality here is that politicians can and often do lean on these to try to indicate the public will on certain issues. And I'm not so sure it's really the public will. For instance, in the case, just to swing back to what's happening in Newfoundland and Labrador, Premier-elect Wakeham said that one of the reasons for this was, and what he heard at the doors during the election, was there wasn't enough information about the project itself for people to make an informed decision. Well, that's on the politicians then, isn't it? And if the public is not informed, or if the people that are going to make the decision are concerned that the public are not informed, how are they going to make an informed decision on a vote? In other words, your job here is to lay there and let people decide about what's happening, and ultimately decide whether it's going to be good in the public interest or the individual interest. And it doesn't always work that you just go to the voters and you're going to get the right answer. This whole idea that the voters are always right. No, they aren't. The voters have made some pretty dumb decisions, dumb choices over the last number of years, in elections all over the world. for a variety of reasons. Well, the most example, and the obvious example of this is the guy in the White House right now. Twice they've elected this guy to be the president of the United States, even though he's a convicted sex offender. He's a fraudster and convicted of that as well. God knows there's a whole long list of other things. There's 39 charges or something like that, that on and on. And they were oblivious to that. That's a wrong decision in my mind. I think in a lot of people's minds. But that was, I guess the ultimate referendum is an election. So there's that. Historically, what about the right to vote? I mean, if the politicians of the day said, we're getting a lot of discussion here that women should have the right to vote and we should hold a referendum. Well, how do you think that would go? Because only men were going to vote on it because women didn't have the right to vote then. At some point, my point is, the elected officials have to stand up and be counted. The buck stops with them, because ultimately they are going to make the decisions on any key issues, whether it's right to vote, whether it's when to vote, how to vote, what to build, what not to build, what the case might be. It's their job. That's what we elect them for. And I fear that too often politicians simply want to back off. Name a key issue, a controversial issue. And how many times have you heard a politician say, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Well, it's your job to feel one way or another about it. And it's your job to be informed and to make sure that you vote accordingly. And you have to take a lot of things into consideration. Yes, what you hear from the public certainly has to be factored into this, but so does the greater good, too. I mean, if we did a referendum, should we raise taxes? Who wants to raise taxes? Who likes to pay more taxes? Hands up? No? Nobody? Okay. And I'm up there, too. Nobody does. But if you were to pass a resolution like that, are people who voted on that, are they aware of what the consequences could be? That if governments didn't raise taxes or had to lower taxes, that means that there's going to be less services? You may not get your garbage collected as often. You may not get the snow plowed. There's a number of different things. If it's a federal thing, if you need services for the Department of Health, you're a veteran who's looking for help. Sorry, your call is going to have to be returned 6-8 weeks from now because we just don't have the staff. That pisses people off. But that's what government spending is all about. And yeah, I know there's 1,000 examples of frivolous spending, and we get that. But when you craft a question for a referendum, which is what they're talking about doing now, how the question is actually framed is very, very important as to how people are going to respond to it. And ultimately, if citizen A goes to vote and says, yeah, I'm against that, I think it's stupid to raise taxes, they're simply looking at I don't want to pay any more taxes. But do they understand that there's going to be a broader implication to the community at large? At some point, and politicians who are worth their salt, at some point are going to have to make a decision to say, I know I'm hearing a lot of negativity about this, but I'm hearing some positives as well. It may be a tough decision, and there's going to be a lot of people that don't like it, but I've done the evaluation, and I've decided it's for the common good. It's for the greater good, for the community, for the province, for the country, whatever the case might be. And ultimately, as we said, the politicians are the ones that are going to have to decide on this. And you can't elect officials and simply let them sit back and say, well, I don't want to get anybody angry at me, so I'm not going to vote yes or no to this. I'm just going to go with the will of whatever this referendum is. And I'm not for a second, because I know I'm going to get feedback, because I have every time I've talked about this in the past on the radio shows and on blogs, that, well, you're just discounting the public opinions. No, I'm not. It should be factored in. But, the results of a vote that can be skewed one way or another by the way the question is asked and, who votes and when they vote, that should be a factor. You weigh that in, but ultimately the elected official has to look at the big picture as well. And I don't know that they all do that. And that's one of the things that concerns me. It's a crutch for some politicians. It can be a useful tool, but oftentimes it's being used for the other element of this, to simply abdicate their responsibility. To shirk their responsibility, because they're pretty comfortable. There's an awful lot of elected officials that have shown a lot of courage, and I admire them for doing that. And they make tough calls, which eventually were proven to be the correct call. Sometimes they prove not to be, I know, but that's the risk you take, isn't it, with politics and with governing, that there's going to be that, which is why we've talked about, I don't know how many times, it's our responsibility as citizens and as voters to make sure that we do our homework and we elect the right people for public office that can make those decisions. Maybe not always the decisions we want, but we understand that individual is going to do their work, do their research, and present an educated opinion and an educated vote on the issues. That's why we have governing bodies. If we're simply going to rely on public opinion and referendum in situations like that, why have a parliament? Why have a city council? Why, they have a job to do. And I'm not saying we get rid of them. I'm saying we demand that they do more and that they do their jobs responsibly. So I don't know what's going to happen in Newfoundland. I guess in some way, shape, or form, some public input into this, and maybe they are going to hold a referendum. I don't know. But I've just seen too many examples of it where basically they throw that out there and say, well, we want to hear from the public. And maybe it's just to pacify the public to say, see, well, you had a voice in this. There's always a voice in this. You see, elected officials, be they MPs, MPPs, councillors, they should always be open to listening to their constituents about all these key issues. So you do have a voice in these key issues, whether it's to build a water project, whether it's to fix a harbor up, whether it's to do any number of different things, any tough choices the governments are going to have to make. But it's up to the individuals, as we've said time and time again. And I don't know that we are all well served by holding referenda on some of these issues. Do your job, politicians. And yes, go out to the people and talk to them if you want. But for you to simply say, well, I'll abide by whatever they say, that is not your job. And we compensate politicians very well in this country at just about every level. And I'm not suggesting they don't earn their money, because I think it's a very tough job. I did it municipally for 9.5 years, and I know how difficult it can be. And sometimes you make unpopular decisions. But if you've got somebody who's been elected and held office for a number of years by sitting on the fence on key issues, you are not being well served. Or if you have somebody who's simply going to say, well, I really don't want to state my opinion one way or another, I'll just decide, what the referendum is going to be, or I'll, listen to, for 20 minutes the constituents and make my decision on that. There's more to it than that. Governing is a complex situation. And you can't just boil it down to one element and say, well, we're just going to have a referendum and that's going to decide what's happening, because it's not always the right choice. And there are ramifications, sometimes significant ramifications to doing these sorts of things. I want to see politicians be responsible for their own actions and for their own votes. And that means they just do the research. And if you don't think they're up to it, don't put them in office. There's a lot of people that just love to sit on fences and try to avoid the publicity and to avoid the spotlight as much as possible. And, they can have long, comfortable careers with all the benefits of elected office, but are they really serving the public? We as voters have to take the responsibility. We have to elect the right people. And if somebody wants to use a referendum, I'm not saying don't do it, but don't make it the be-all and end-all into the decision-making process, because I don't think the public, and I don't think the community or the country, for that matter, is well served by simply doing what oftentimes really just kind of ends up being a public relations exercise. And is that really the way that you want to govern? I'm not so sure that's the best way to do it. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty damn sure that it's not the best way to do it. So elected officials, be on the lookout. And you, me, voters, let's do a better job of not just putting the right people in office, but once they're there, let's demand, not just ask, but demand that they do their jobs and they take a stand on issues. Anybody who's in elected office at any level of government that says, well, I haven't decided yet, if there's an issue that's been debated for quite some time, they are not serving the public in any way, shape, or form. And if they're worried more about the next election than they are about doing what's right for the community, then you got the wrong person there. That's it for this edition of the podcast. I know we'll talk more about this in future podcasts, because I always get feedback every time we raise this issue. But thank you for being with us today. If you're watching on YouTube, great to have you with us. Hit that notification bell. Make sure you pass this on to others. And thank you all to those who are subscribing. We're getting a lot of folks jumping on board right now. These are big issues, whether it's talking about referenda, whether it's talking about international trade deals, local trade deals, whatever the case might be. We want people to be informed, and we want people to be able to feel free to share their opinions and have that dialogue back and forth. That's how we get informed decisions. So thank you for the support through your subscriptions. Thank you to Madeline Kelly, too, for the great work putting this one together, as always. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.